By the end of today's episode, you will be in a far better position to understand why you become amotivated, why you procrastinate, how to ensure motivation on an ongoing basis, and even how to leverage effort and the desire to become motivated as a way to do just that, to become more motivated. We are going to cover tools that will allow you to leverage your dopamine in order to have maximum motivation, to overcome sticking points, which include things like procrastination, by understanding what are called dopamine dynamics. The two key things to understand about dopamine is that we have dopamine peaks that are triggered by certain behaviors, certain compounds, drugs or substances, food, etc., and that we have a dopamine baseline. Our dopamine baseline is our reservoir of dopamine. It's how full or empty our dopamine pool is. And that dopamine pool is the pool of dopamine that we use in order to create those dopamine peaks. And when those peaks come down, sometimes they go back to baseline and sometimes they go to lower than baseline, which we call the trough. If any of this seems confusing, I want you just to imagine a wave pool. If you've ever seen a wave pool, it's basically a concrete pool, and there are waves within it, okay? Duh. Those waves can be of different heights, so they can be little ripples, and we can think of those as little mini peaks, or they can be big waves. They can be really big crashing waves. If the height of those waves and the frequency of those waves is very, very large, some of that water, which here I'm using as an analogy to dopamine, can slosh out of the wave pool and the baseline drops. However, if those peaks are small enough or they are seldom enough, well, then the baseline, that is the water level in that pool, stays more or less constant. Desire for things increases dopamine. But then our level of dopamine drops below baseline, and it's that drop below baseline that triggers the motivation to bring that dopamine level back up by going and pursuing the thing that you wanted in the first place. Now, by understanding that a craving triggers a peak in dopamine that makes you motivated, but then drops your level of dopamine below baseline, which makes you even more motivated, you are already halfway through the conceptual aspect of today's podcast. Because if you can understand that, you will understand why, for instance, when you initially want something or you think you want something, it puts you into motion, but then pretty quickly you're starting to feel the pain of not having that, and that is also contributing to your desire to pursue that thing. Okay, this is a subtle effect, but if you watch for it, you'll start to see it or experience it within yourself. Your craving for things is not just about craving for those things per se. It's also a desire to relieve the pain of not having those things. And if you can internalize that and start to develop an awareness around it, you will be in an amazing position to leverage all sorts of aspects of the dopamine system in order to increase your motivation, especially when things get really hard or when you have the propensity to procrastinate. What generates dopamine peaks? What generates desire to pursue goals? What causes our readout of whether or not we achieved a goal or not? In other words, what allows us to learn how to pursue goals of different kinds, not just get good at achieving one kind of goal, but really understand and get really, really good at setting goals and pursuing goals of different kinds that are adaptive in different areas of life? Well, all of that is possible using the same basic set of dopamine circuits and the same basic dynamics of dopamine. So for instance, if we are going to feel motivated at all, that is, if we are going to wake up in the morning or have any period of time during our day in which we feel like we are capable of pursuing goals, we are going to have a healthy level of baseline dopamine. In other words, we are going to have enough dopamine in the wave pool, enough water in the wave pool, that is, before we can generate any waves or peaks in dopamine, let alone troughs and the rest. So how do we achieve a healthy baseline level of dopamine? Well, there we can really look to some foundational practices that perhaps you've heard about on this podcast before, and that to some of you might seem a little mundane, although some of them are a bit more sophisticated, maybe even esoteric. The good news is that we can all control these things.